So welcome back, everybody. You may remember that in the last talk, we discussed how our taxonomy, in other words, the names we give to organisms and groups of organisms, must be aligned with the evolutionary history, with the phylogeny of the organisms. And since there have been millions of branches in the evolutionary tree, we saw that the Linnaean categories are somewhat inadequate. And so our way around that was to name the clades. Now today what I want to do is give you a glimpse into what the evolutionary history of life looks like, what the phylogeny of life at its most basic level looks like. So let's take a look at that. Life has been on the planet for at least 3.5 billion years, but multicellular life didn't evolve until about 600 million years before present. It's pretty amazing to think that it took 2 to 3 billion years of evolution on single-celled organisms before multicellular organisms occurred. But it's equally amazing to think that in the mere 600 million years since life has evolved, it has evolved into these myriad plant, animal, and fungal forms that we see on the earth. And this has occurred during 1/7 of the time of the total time that life has existed on Earth. The broadest categories of life use characteristics of the cell to classify them. And you might have guessed that it's aspects of the cell itself that would be most important for the biggest branches. Let's take a look at the important taxonomic characters of life. One thing that we're going to look at is the cell type. Is it a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell? And in a few seconds, I will explain the difference between those two. The second thing goes into the chemical composition of the cell wall and sometimes the cell membrane. And the details of that are a little bit beyond the level of this course, but someday you will get to them. Another characteristic that we look at this broadest level taxonomy is multicellularity versus unicellularity. And we also look at feeding strategy, autotrophic versus heterotrophic. And then there's some esoteric ideas about how genes are replicated, which we won't be talking about at all in this course. Take a look at these three cells here. The upper two are what are called eukaryotic cells, and the bottom one is a prokaryotic cell. Why don't you switch off the video and take a look at the picture and see what similarities and differences you can see. Well, now that you've done that, can you see that the eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, which is surrounded by a membrane, and then organelles inside it, which are also surrounded by membranes, whereas the bacterial cell has no organelles, nor a nucleus surrounded by a membrane. On the other hand, the cell wall is present in both the bacteria and in the plant cell, but not in the animal cell. We're going to get back to these when we study cell biology in the next unit, but I wanted to introduce these to you now. The most inclusive taxon for life is called the domain, and there are 3 domains that are currently recognized, and these are broken up into 6 kingdoms. So let's take a look at that. The 3 domains are the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryota, or the eukarya. If you take a look here, you will see in this evolutionary tree that the earliest branch to split off are the bacteria. They're all unicellular. Then next splits off the archaea, and then finally the eukaryota, which have this eukaryotic cell type. The bacteria and the archaea are both prokaryotic. Let's look at this a little further. The bacteria, prokaryotic, which means they have no nucleus and no other membrane-bound organelles. They have a single circular chromosome. They have a ribosome, which is small. We call it the bacterial ribosome. What's a ribosome, you ask? Well, it is the organelle that is used to make proteins. And proteins are what the genetic code codes for. So they're central to life. And it has a unique cell wall. And as I say, we won't go into the chemistry of that uniqueness. The archaea are also prokaryotic, which means they're unicellular. They don't have a nucleus, and they don't have membrane-bound organelles. But their ribosome is larger than the bacterial ribosome. And they have a specialized cell wall and a slightly different cell membrane. The eukaryotes have a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. In other words, they're a eukaryotic cell. They have a larger ribosome. We refer to it as the eukaryotic ribosome. And some have a cell wall, some do not. Some of them are multicellular and some of them are not. The three domains are split into 6 kingdoms, and here are the names of those kingdoms. The eubacteria, the archaebacteria, which are both prokaryotic, and you can imagine they correspond to the bacteria and the archaea. The protists, which are eukaryotic, the plants, the animals, and the fungi, right? So let's take a look at some of the aspects of these in this table that I've put together for you. The domain bacteria has a single kingdom, eubacteria. An example is Streptococcus pneumoniae, which is the bacterium that can give you bacterial pneumonia. It's a prokaryotic cell type. The cell walls have a special chemical called peptidoglycan in them. They're all unicellular, and the bacteria can be autotrophic or heterotrophic. And you can imagine why that's true. Bacteria were around for billions of years, so autotrophs evolved first, and then heterotrophs said, hey, we can just eat other bacteria, right? And they evolved to do that. The domain archaea has a single kingdom called archaebacteria. Staphylococcus marinus here depicted is an example. These bacteria are often found in extreme environments. They're called extremophiles when they are. And those environments include hot vents in the ocean, salt flats, any place that's really, really extreme compared to the rest of the Earth's ecosystems. They're all prokaryotic. They have cell walls with unique lipids, which are fats. They're all unicellular, and they can be autotrophic or heterotrophic. Now, the domain eukarya, or eukaryota, has 4 kingdoms: the protists, the fungi, the plantae, and the animalia. Let's go through. An example of a protist is the paramecium, famous from the competition experiments in the ecology unit. Has a eukaryotic cell type. Some of the protists have cell walls and some do not. Some are unicellular and some are multicellular, and they can be autotrophs or heterotrophs. The fungi, here's a mushroom that you could be familiar with. The cell walls all have this special chemical called chitin in them. They're almost all multicellular, although the yeasts are famously unicellular, and they're all heterotrophic. The plants, they have cell walls with cellulose in them. They're almost all multicellular, and they're all autotrophic. And the animals, they have no cell walls. They're multicellular, and they're all heterotrophic. So now let's take a look at the phylogeny of life. And what you can see here is that the bacteria are joined together by a single common ancestor, so that's a good name. The archaea have a single common ancestor, so that's a good name. The plants here have a single common ancestor right here, so that's a good name. The fungi have a single common ancestor, so that's a good name. The animalia, well, they have a single common ancestor, so that's a good name. But look, the slime molds, the red algae, the malaria parasite, Giardia protozoa, all sorts of other protozoa are all sister groups to other major categories, which means that kingdom is not really a valid clade. It's not a reasonable name. And so I hate to say it, when your kids are growing up, you will have only had to learn 6 domains, but they're going to have had to learn 12, 13, 15 domains. Because once we do the work to figure out the history of life, the phylogeny of the eukaryotes, we're going to find that a lot of these basal groups have their own kingdoms. So get ready for that. There'll be a lot of new kingdoms. By the way, when I was in college, there were only 2 kingdoms, animals and plants, and everything fit into that. And there weren't even any domains at that point. So you can see as we've learned more about life, we've had to have a more complex language for discussing the history of life. That's it for today. I hope that you have a good idea of the most basic categories of life and how amazingly different they are, from animals to bacteria like things that are clearly intermediate in some ways between eukaryotes and bacteria, and yet still look like bacteria, but also live in these incredibly hostile environments, to this whole world of protists, which is alien world to us as multicellular organisms. And then we have the three large multicellular groups with which you are all familiar: the plants, the fungi, and the animals. Until next time, you all should go outside, take a look at nature, and ask biological questions. And I'll see you soon.